Well, so thank you everybody for being here on a hot weekday evening. I really appreciate, and it's been a great pleasure to connect with 350.org Chicago for a whole bunch of reasons. Tonight, I will try to illustrate that under the challenging times we're in, why finding ways to utilize whatever interests or skills you have and to really take part in the just energy transition with a huge emphasis on the just part will be something that I think that you'll both value doing for its own sake, but also because we are in crisis times. That's putting it mildly. And so I think that one of the most critical issues is recognizing that as absolutely critical as climate and justice is, we will have neither of those things if we don't have a democracy. And I don't think that we solve all of the horrific actions taking place in DC and elsewhere through climate, but I do think that it is the touchstone starting ground. And of course, everyone's key issue: housing costs, minimum wage, injustice, deportation, attack on DACA, on DACA. All these things are critical, but I'm hoping to convince you that to really have an impact, this is really the place to start. And so I'll just drop in the chat if you're interested in some of the work that my team is doing, and I'll describe what my team is as we move through things. This gives the link to Blue Sky, which we're also on LinkedIn and various places, but Blue Sky is where we try to post about once a day actions that we're doing. So I'm going to jump in, and I don't know exactly what sort of protocol and style works best for you all, but what I'm hoping is that people will feel totally enabled and empowered to jump in at any point. Don't wait for the Q&A. I will not be offended if I'm talked over. I actually think that the whole point of this is to really find ways to leverage all of our skills and build a community where justice and the energy transition is what we're doing, but what we're really doing is returning to the kind of forms of democracy that, whether you're a Democrat or Republican or one of the many other flavors, that you recognize this country is teetering on the brink or has beyond the brink of moving into a state that I've seen no historical parallel closer than 1930s Germany to where we are today. And we know how that turned out. So again, I'll try to talk about a number of these topics. I am a physicist by training. And so my starting ground in almost all issues of policy is to look at what are the technical elements and substrates that my skill set and those of my students and collaborators in the US, in China, in East Africa, in Southeast Asia can best work on to do two things. And the first part of that process is to quantify and highlight injustice, but not make this into a pity party or a whining factory. The goal is to enable and empower action, not just to rack up some laundry list of injustices. I think we all know that it's not very hard to find injustice along racial, gender, locational, other grounds. And it's important work, but we have to move ourselves much more rapidly into action. And so what I'll try to highlight today will be some of the places where at least I feel, whether it's from data science or from the physical sciences or for appreciating that interdisciplinary work is difficult, that there's ways to get things done, and there are huge opportunities even under this I will call it as I see it, this evil administration that has decided that cruelty, lack of compassion, lack of rule of law, dirty tricks is actually a good strategy. And, I don't want to point to anybody on this call. Suspect everyone voted their conscience in past elections. But the fact is, we have seen, no matter what you think, if there was a steal away from Harris or whatever else, the fact is we have seen an ugly turn in this country where groups are focused on greed at the individual or local level. And while it's easy to say that and kind of pontificate, the question is, what do we do dramatically differently in a way that if you are already committed, you can show that there are positive outcomes. And if you are on the fence or opposed to clean energy for ideological or other grounds, that you can see there are real fault lines in society that leaning hard into energy and the just transition would actually make your life easier, whether you're, left wing, right wing, libertarian, whatever else. And so that's what's going to try to be the focus of what I'll do today. And so I'll start off with the most boring of all possible slides to highlight how far from a minimally acceptable path we are. And so this is the classic IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, generic graph of the growth in emissions, the black line leading up to today, and then the different pathways down towards what our goal must be. And there is no scientific debate. There may be ideological debate. There may be kind of racist, classist, other debates, but there's no debate that we need to be at zero or negative emissions, meaning we are drawing down the atmospheric loading of greenhouse gases, not just bringing our new emissions to zero. And if we look at current policies pre-Trump, we would be in that light blue band at the top. And then again, pre-Trump, if we look at hard commitments, you get that orange line. If we look at pledges and targets that countries made but clearly didn't intend to keep, and I won't even get yet to the US, which made a series of investments and commitments, and then under this administration walked away from them in a way that is hurting everybody, but I'm going to argue is hurting the US more than anybody else. And the bottom green line is the pathway we need to be on. And you'll notice that this green pathway drops down at a rate that is essentially faster than our growth in emissions. And since our growth is exponential, you don't have to be a scientist to know that that means there's almost no way that we will get on that green line, even if we had, kind of Bill McKibben as president today. That path is probably one we have already foregone. And that means that no matter what we say about what good things, virtuous things we might do, what it means is that really anyone under 30 is going to be living in a world transformed so badly that people of my generation, twice 30, would not recognize the world you will be inheriting. And so it would be perfectly appropriate to focus your efforts, if you are in the younger generations, to be suing my generation. I would argue you should be doing that, but that's only a start. My generation has basically said, we do not care about you through our actions, through our financial choices, through our ignorance about science and our ignorance about what being in a civil and caring society is. So there will be anger. It will be directed at people of my age, and I think apologies are long past due, but that's the world that we need to be in. And the drama and the dynamic of that world are really remarkable. The climate change we are already seeing, from days when it's hotter in the Arctic than it is in Chicago. Right now, it's about 95 where I'm sitting in the Eastern Shore of Maryland. We are seeing unprecedented climate change today, and I could do a whole talk about it. I don't think it's that valuable to do so, but I do want to highlight a little bit of what we have chosen to walk away from. And that is, it was never clear we were going to have a chance to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius, about 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit. We, as the IPCC, through a tortured process, set 1.5 degrees as the goal. That is almost certainly lost for the reasons I've just said. And what you'll notice is that for all of these different indicators, extreme heat waves, sea level rise, species loss, et cetera, more or less 2 degrees, a goal that is almost certainly also out of sight because the world has warmed by almost 1.3 already, is just about twice as bad as the 1.5 target. And so we will be seeing unprecedented changes, and there will be a whole art form of studying things like, if you remember the run on toilet paper during COVID, well, the run on food is going to be far worse. And I would say within a decade, we will see food prices spiking, not because of avian flu and egg prices, but we will see food scarcities. We will see whole-scale damaged ecosystems, entire fishing or other occupations having to shut down for blocks of time, or going on where only the rich get those items. And so we are entering what I would call the ugly and hungry time. And the question is, does this kind of sharpen our resolve, or do we, as we seem to be doing, just degenerate into a pathway of the rich really do not give a blank about anybody else, and the poor are not empowered to do anything about it? And so with that very, very depressing introduction, let me talk a little bit about what we know, and that is the science of climate change is unassailed, undebated. Well, it's heavily debated, but there is no doubt about the path we're on. And the real question is, can we not avoid climate change, but can we avoid killing each other off in our single-minded approach to dealing with scarcity and greed by stepping over the next person? And just one version of that is that if we think climate change is a bad story, greed is a worse story. And so what this illustrates here is that the rich and elites around the world, whether they are elites in the US or Europe or Nairobi or Johannesburg or Durban or Jakarta, they are more self-similar to each other than they are to the other people in their own country. The rich travel in similar ways, buy in similar ways, sell in similar ways, and the richest 1% of the world are responsible for about 15% of global greenhouse emissions. The richest 10%, over half, and the poorest half of the planet are less than 10% of emissions. This means that no matter what we say we are planning to do, crises are in the future, and whether you think that we are going to see food riots or heat waves, I mean, this kind of dramatic science fiction movie events, what we do know is that when people get stressed, they do even worse things to each other. And climate change is the great stressor in this case. And if that wasn't a sad enough introduction, the other part of the story is that as poorly as we're doing on climate change, we're doing equally poorly on the UN agreed to 17 different so-called sustainable development goals, from having no poverty on the planet by 2030 to giving energy access or making it available to the 800 million people without it today, to having gender equality in schools, clean water availability, preserving what the UN recommends, which is returning a third of the planet to nature, both onshore and offshore. We are making absolutely terrible progress on those goals. Most of them are stagnated, and you don't need to read through all the details, but this picture here shows the 17 goals. And what you see is there's a huge amount of orange and red on here, meaning that across the board, something that took 10 years for the UN to define, which is already a bit sad, we are making as poor progress on meeting the local benefits of compassion as we are on the climate story. And while this double whammy of a bad climate story and a bad set of social indicators sounds like it's horrific, I actually think that there is a silver lining, if you will, and that silver lining is that through the good efforts on the science and technology side and the more important efforts on social organization, we actually have plenty of data to come to the conclusion that clean and just energy is actually cheaper for everyone, not just the poor, but the rich as well. And that if you want to live on the planet, the benefit of leaning into these things is far larger than the downsides. And of course, that statement would have been true if Vice President Harris had been president today. But of course, we've moved in another direction where we are zeroing out the U.S. Agency for International Development, the EPA, the Department of Education. And so university after university, these are just the two I'm associated with today, Berkeley and Johns Hopkins, are both writing in all of their monthly and annual magazines that research matters. And if there was one article I would urge everyone to read, about the situation we're in now, no matter who you voted for, it would be the quite sobering and quite amazing editorial in the Washington Post from 3 weeks ago called "The Suicide of a Superpower." And I don't think there's any more clear and direct and tweetable or Xable statement than that is what we are seeing the US doing. And this is about like going on a diet by excising 80 to 90% of our brain. And so we are in a truly strange position, despite the fact that we have actually made remarkable progress on both the technical and the institutional side of what we need. So what you see here are the three exponential graphs that if we chose to act on the investment in research and development and deployment that has happened in the US and China and Europe and Kenya and Iceland um, and East Malaysia, what we see here is that the forecasts for how quickly the use of solar cells, batteries, and electric vehicles around the planet would take off. Those dark lines are the forecasts by the international agencies, the kind of standard keepers of data around energy innovation. And you can see that what's going on with the colored arrows is that we are exceeding the growth of these technologies dramatically. And this is a remarkable statement because not only are we seeing this exciting growth, but we are seeing this growth in a world where the subsidies that we have in place for fossil fuels total, depending whose metrics you use, between $5 and $7 trillion a year, dominated by subsidies for dirty energy in China and the US. And the subsidy of 5 to 7 trillion is 5 to 7 times larger than the current investment. So I'm comparing CapEx, if you will, for the economists, investment in clean energy hardware of about 1 trillion a year with the 5 to 7 trillion in just the subsidy, not the investment in capital and labor and things in fossil energy. And so the fact that clean energy has done as well as it has with this remarkable head start or handicap that we're giving fossil energy tells you how easy this transition would be if we were able to not put ideology aside. That's too strong a fantasy. But if we simply level the playing field, and I'll get back to that at the very end of the talk in the ways that I actually think that would not be that difficult, but we are choosing that that diet of brain matter instead. So this story is so remarkable that since about 2021, it has now been cheaper, unsubsidized, to build a clean energy power plant than to simply operate an existing fossil power plant. And that's even before you think about should there be a carbon tax or a cap and trade or cap and dividend or all these kind of fancy mechanisms that academics and left-leaning politicians like myself like to think about. This is a remarkable gift we have given ourselves, but we have decided to really ignore it. So there's so many ways that, I could end the talk right there. I could kind of highlight the story, but one version that leans into what we know about information technology is to simply compare how we've done on the energy information or energy data science frontier. And so one way to think about it is that back in 1975, the best and most powerful computer was the Cray supercomputer, about $40 million for 160 megaflops, 160 mega operations. And today the iPhone at about $500 is dramatically more powerful, 11 teraflops compared to 160 megaflops. And so if we think about this comparison of performance, we're doing about 70,000 times better in performance today over, call it 5 decades. And the price is some 80,000 times cheaper. So if we multiply these two together, we get this kind of remarkable performance times price where we're sort of 5 billion times better than we were in 1975. That's the technological substrate or starting point. Now, we know there's lots of reasons why that's not the full story. Technology is not equally available around the planet, but it's kind of one way to think about this picture of Moore's Law, which many of us see in kind of writings in The Economists and Wall Street journals and Scientific American, which says that computing power doubles about every 18 months. And the way this was described by Gordon Moore, the founder of Intel, was that the number of computing nodes on a conventional chip, we're not going to talk about quantum computing today, doubles about every 18 months. And so we are getting better and better at both the energy technology, the curves I showed on the previous slide, and we are doing better and better at the information side. And it's really why every time someone says, well, clean energy can't compete, it's not going to get better, I really go back to the Mark Twain quote, reports of my death, the end of innovation are greatly exaggerated. So we have a wonderful technical toolkit which we are deciding and choosing to ignore. And so this is the graph I showed you before, showing this exponential boom in solar compared to those yellow lines, which are the annual forecasts made by the International Energy Agency, essentially a backwards looking organization by design, not because they're not very smart people. And so that's the world of what we could be taking advantage of. But what we know is that there's a wonderfully tragic statement by the futurist William Gibson, who has said over and over again what I think is probably the most chilling statement, and that is, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And we make the best of everything available for the rich, or they make it for themselves, depending how you want to say it. And we don't do that for the poor. So one way to think about this in quantitative terms is to say, let's just take a look at how we are treating this new technological toy, solar power. And so with two former students in my laboratory, they're actually postdoctoral fellows, who are each now professors. Debbie is a professor at Tufts, Sergio at Texas. We went to Google, that flies drones and takes pictures of every rooftop in the US because that's legal. And then we used that data to map out where is solar across the country on every rooftop of every home, apartment building, business, et cetera, et cetera. And we combined that with census data that, a little scary, but if you treat the data properly and you use various security filters, you can go to the US government, get the data, not at the household level, but you can find the income down to the block level of essentially each neighborhood across the country, and you can find the race of people across the country. There are a couple gray areas, mixed race, et cetera, et cetera. And so we found, at one level, I hope won't surprise you, we found that the average amount of solar in a white majority neighborhood, and these are not zip codes, these are much smaller, they're called census tracts, that the average amount of solar in a white neighborhood is about 30 to 40% more likely to see solar than a neighborhood with no racial majority. And if it's a Hispanic dominated community, 50% or more Hispanic, solar is about 45% less likely. And a black majority neighborhood of the same income level, it's about 50 to 60% less likely. That I don't think should surprise you. It didn't surprise me. But what did surprise me is that that holds across an order of magnitude of income, meaning for neighborhoods that are at or below the poverty line, think of Watts in Los Angeles or some of the poorest parts of Chicago or elsewhere, all the way up to neighborhoods where the average income is $250,000 a year. That trend is steady, meaning we see that level of inequality in who has solar across essentially the entire spectrum of income in the United States. So what that says to me is a very sad but simple truth. It says that all of the talk we have about Head Start programs, investing in low-income communities, making no interest loans available for underprivileged or immigrants or women-headed households, whatever is your metric, what it says is something exceedingly unsurprising, and that is that if we don't fix the system, it doesn't matter how superior the new technology is. And as someone who has lived in a home powered by solar with for the last 25 years and for the last 7 years with a battery, so that I can run off solar essentially all the time. And I am a privileged individual living in a very nice part of Oakland, California, or now Eastern Shore of Maryland. What it says is that the clean energy opportunities, cheaper, better, more just, etc., aren't going to produce better outcomes unless we also at the same time fight the bigger fight. I would argue it is the fight that used to be or still is called good trouble. And that is we need to use and leverage these technological innovations in ways that get us to the root cause of the issue, which is not climate or energy, it is inequality. And that's a much harder and bigger fight, but it means that, to me, we don't solve the climate crisis without being completely engaged in social justice. And we have no chance to solve the climate crisis unless we make social justice an equal partner in the story. And so these are just some of the newspaper articles that came out about that article that I highlighted, which had an interesting genesis. It was done initially in California, and then we expanded to it nationwide. California adopted a pro-justice climate policy through the agitation of social justice groups, not through the agitation of kind of white elite environmentalists. It was a social justice movement that said, we demand in California 35% as a floor, not a ceiling, of total infrastructure spending through the climate bill, to be devoted also to social justice, to serve minority communities, women-headed households, fence-line communities, etc. When Vice President Biden was running for president, he visited with the governor of California and said, this is a really good policy. I'm going to take your Justice 35 and I'm going to do it 5% better. What I'm going to do is launch Justice 40, which was the Biden era program that said 40% of federal infrastructure spending had to be spent on those same marginalized communities. And that program was working, whether you liked President Biden, as I did, or whether you were in the Sleepy Joe category, doesn't really matter. That policy was working. And it was working so much so that Republican members of the U.S. House and Senate who voted against the Inflation Reduction Act in their reelection campaign in 2024 campaigned on its merits. So whether you want to call that hypocrisy or realism or whatever else, it is what it is. And what it means is that we have seen little pockets, a Republican member of the House in Wyoming saying we should remove the prohibition on solar, angering President Mr. Trump. So we have seen little pockets here and there of resistance, but as this big, I'm not going to say the B word, or I'll say a more nasty B word for this bill that is being debated, we are seeing a wholesale assault on sane government by members of the Republican Party that simply refuse to stand up and be counted, even to things they campaigned on 7 months ago. So it is a sad state of affairs. But what it means is that whether you want to fight the national or international or local level, there is a remarkable database of opportunities, projects, aspects of this story that, depending where and how your skills fit best in, whether it's science skills, communication skills, advertising skills, community organization skills, art skills, all of these things are critical because we, the climate science community, have clearly failed you. Because all of the story I've just told you should be enough for even a moderately successful politician to run with that and be elected to all kinds of great offices. And clearly, the science community does not know how to leverage what it has started but not finished in the process. And so, whether wherever your skills lie, there are critical aspects of this to you. So let me just highlight one little bit of the story in a bit of a personal story. So Manuel Pastor is a good friend of mine. He's a professor. He was at University of California, Santa Cruz. Now he's at University of Southern California, running the Urban Poverty Center. And what we wrote five years ago was a piece in the San Francisco Chronicle arguing that California's climate goal, which would make California a middling European state, good in some areas, not great in others, but certainly better than Poland, better than Italy, arguably not as good as Norway's complicated because where they get their money to be green is fossil fuels, but arguably not as good as a Switzerland or an Austria or now the UK, but a respectable member of the European community, but a much bigger economy than any of them, because California is now the world's fourth largest economy, having passed Japan. So we argued in the press and then in conversations with the governor that California's climate goals that says we need to go carbon neutral by 2045 are not good enough, and that the science story says that we should be carbon negative in 5 years. That will clearly not happen now. My models, the models of a number of others, says we could get there with a cost savings, with a more secure grid, with more storage on it, hardened against wildfires, all of these great things. We will probably not get there because we have not found a way to step around the politics of the story. But let me give you an example of a technical lever that starts a conversation, that opens up a social dialogue that California has stepped into pretty heavily, China and Norway have stepped into, and would save literally everyone in the US money with some incredibly simple actions that, again, we would potentially have had under a President Harris. We will obviously not have under the current regime. And this starts with a technical story, but again, that's only the beginning. So what you're seeing here is a slightly complicated looking graph. It's called the duck curve, and you can see that this artist has decided to make it into the dinosaur or the plesiosaur curve. So what you're seeing is the energy demand in California from midnight to midnight over one day, going back into 2015 up until 2 years ago, 2023. And the reason why I want to dwell so long on this graph is that my good friend Amory Lovins, a climate and energy activist, has a saying, and that is, "In God we trust, but everyone else bring data." And that's what this graph is all about. And the story here is one where equally engaged policy analysts, academics, social justice campaigners, and all manner of folks, all of whom are thinking about this issue, come up with radically different pictures. And it's why the climate community, while creating cool stuff, has not moved ahead in ways, and why we critically need this larger set of voices. And so let me explain this graph in a little bit to you. And so what you're seeing here, again, in this duck curve, is the demand of energy between midnight and about 6 a.m., and it's pretty flat. Most of us are asleep, except for college students. And then during the day, we turn things on, and at night, when businesses are still running, industry is still running, and then people turn on things at home, you see the energy demand spikes. So go back to 2015, the power demand is pretty flat. As California started to install solar, the actual net demand went down a little bit during the day because we had some solar 10 years ago. But as we installed more and more solar, we hollowed out the back of this duck or dinosaur, so much so that by 2023, net demand went negative, right? See that 2023 goes through zero, but then late in the day when solar is going away, because we have this thing called nighttime, the demand for energy rises, but the amount of solar is not there. So look what this caused within the energy and climate community. It was kind of a moment of crisis. People like me, a very simple physicist, scientist, say this is great. This shows we can install more and more solar. We can meet more and more of our demand. And solar is getting better and cheaper, as I've shown you. And so what we need is then a way to store the energy. Well, my economist friends look at this graph in horror with a totally different perspective. And I'm not trying to say they're wrong and I'm right. I'm trying to say that our perspectives are different. My economist friends looked at this graph, this duck curve, and said, this is a disaster. Utilities provide us power. And if the net demand goes negative, then they have nothing to do. They're not going to invest in new infrastructure. And indeed, the grid in the United States is crumbling. It is decrepit by comparison to Europe and to China. And so what they said is that this advance of solar, while good in some theoretical way, is sending exactly the wrong signal to markets. And so people like me pushed back and said, no, 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 it's the markets that need to change. And they said, no, 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 you need to understand that we only move as fast as our ability to work through mechanisms, right? This is kind of a version of the story. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go in a group. And I guess the science community said, effectively, we want to go alone, not bringing on economists, not bringing on political groups, not bringing on indigenous and black and brown communities that say, look, you're installing solar in rich neighborhoods, you're leaving us behind. This is a failure to see outside of one's own little window. So what would be a simple set of solutions to this problem? Well, the simplest one is to note that we're not only getting better and cheaper solar panels, we're also getting better and cheaper electric vehicles. Now, solar panels and EVs were initially only available to the rich. That is absolutely true, which means if we treat these new technologies the way we treat old ones, like in the paper I showed you with my two students, it means we take this wonderful resource and we badly misuse it. We don't take advantage of its opportunities. After all, if we take public money to subsidize solar and electric vehicles for those people that have a rooftop and a garage to put their solar panels on, we are taking money from the general population and giving it to the already entitled. Now, from a technical perspective, you can sort of argue there's a bit of an argument there. It's why Tesla started out with a cute roadster that was only bought by rich people. They used that capital to get some federal subsidies and other things and then make a better and better car. That's what BYD is in China, and BYD is now a better, bigger EV company than is Tesla. But you have to own property to put up solar. And you have to have a garage to put your EV in because otherwise it's not convenient to charge it. I live in a condo in DC and I don't have a place to charge, so I only charge at work. And when you drive to work, you discover there's not very many charging stations. And unless you're the VP who gets preferential parking, you don't get an opportunity. And that's compounded if you're low income. And so we take this wonderful gift of clean hardware and we make it only available in the William Gibson way to the rich. Well, let's stop for a second and just notice that each electric vehicle is essentially a big iPhone, I would argue. Each EV is a smart appliance with a big battery in it. The battery in each electric vehicle could power 2 or 3 homes. So if we only said that each EV sold in the US must be smartly enabled with technology far simpler than what's in your cell phone. And each of those EVs, when plugged in, should be given a signal and that says, would you like to sell power back to the grid? Here's the price. You can take it or leave it. That's a really simple algorithm that even the dumbest piece of hardware can do. Right? I've now seen refrigerators that text you if you're near a grocery store and you're low on milk or eggs. So the circuit to do this is trivial. So for most people in the US, their second largest purchase or lease after their home is their car, and they use it an average of an hour a day. If all of those EVs were smartly connected, like through the Nest thermostat kind of world, not just for rich suburbs, but for the projects, the low income housing areas, depending what your language is, we would have enough batteries to deal with the neck of the duck curve. We could then buy this surplus of power in the middle of the day, right? The power price goes, the demand goes negative. Put it into batteries. Some people would choose to drive home with that power. Others would say, look, here at 5 o'clock, the demand is high. They're offering a high price. I'm going to delay my drive home or drive home a bit earlier and use this battery in my EV to sell power back, and actually my home or my vehicle becomes a source of revenue. That is a remarkably easy technical market story to do. And interestingly enough, the group that has opposed this most strongly until very recently have been utilities. And I hope that sort of makes you fall off your chair, because basically utilities have said, wait, you want to give us twice the business? No, 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 we don't want that. We really would only like to sell you electricity for your washer and dryer and your other thing. We really don't want to sell you energy for your vehicle. Just go about your business and leave us out of the story. And very few utilities, because of ideology or conservatism or whatever else, or lack of education or lack of this bigger vision, there's a whole number of ways to say it that are very uncomplimentary, have chosen to resist this effort to give them your business and to take that business away from oil companies. And yes, there have been some strong ad campaigns for smart oil companies arguing against this, because they see electric vehicles that are now on par of price with gas-powered vehicles and are 1/3 to 1/5 the cost per mile to drive and have incredibly low maintenance. And we now know how to make the batteries of electric vehicles out of non-critical materials. So we're not using cobalt mined with child labor in the Congo if we switch from lithium-ion batteries. So my cell phone, I am complicit, my cell phone has cobalt in it, almost certainly mined in the Congo by child labor. But now we have lithium phosphate batteries that are very similar in performance to these lithium-ion batteries and do not involve cobalt. And lithium is not as rare as we think. Phosphate is very common. So there's an opportunity to lean into not only clean energy, but also a justice perspective, because we could be demanding that Uber and Lyft make vehicles available through subsidy programs and otherwise so that low-income drivers get preferential below cost access to EVs, because it is in all of our best interest. Uber and Lyft, as you know, have finally adopted that strategy, but at the same time, they refuse to acknowledge those drivers or their workers. So we permit incredible unjust practices just because they sound and feel like the most capitalist types of way of doing things. And what if I just spent all this time describing on the EV front wasn't enough? We can even go further and highlight the fact that we could also be using that clean energy surplus in the middle of the day to make hydrogen, not gray hydrogen that comes from fossil gas, natural gas, methane, or blue hydrogen where we have to bury carbon, but we could be using some of this clean energy surplus in the middle of the day to making truly green hydrogen. And when we use that, we could be doing so without any greenhouse gas emissions. So whether you're an energy storage and solar advocate, or whether you're a a hydrogen advocate. I'm very, very mixed feelings, mainly negative about hydrogen, but we'll see. But this is an example, and you can see why I really spent so much time talking about it. So let me do one last example in a similar vein and now stop. And that is, we have seen the rise of wind power. We have seen it become almost as cheap as solar, not quite. While solar prices have dropped 90% in the last decade, wind prices have dropped 60%. But what we are now seeing are new technologies like this one here. These are a series of buoys in the water. If you look up upper right, these buoys are essentially big 40-foot tall teardrop shaped metal canisters with a piston inside, and they go up and down on the waves. And it turns out that an array of these per unit area generates as much energy as does a offshore wind turbine. But you don't have to choose. You can see in the middle picture, you can have an array of these things interspersed with wind turbines. And that's a way to generate energy utilizing the three-quarters of the planet covered by water, not land, as a way to augment as a next step and sort of build a new marine energy frontier. So here's a version of that picture. This is one of those buoys, and you can see that piston going up and down inside. Generates energy. You can even use the pressure on this to desalinate water. There's all kinds of things you can do. And this is just one of many technologies that we could deploy in a way that highlights the justice aspect by investing in marginalized communities at some of the poorest urban areas in the US, often around ports, Port of Philadelphia, Port of Baltimore, Long Beach, a number of places, and sort of push this technology frontier outwards. Well, unfortunately, we are not doing either of those. And so my last slide is just to kind of highlight what it is we chose to throw away with the transition from the Biden team to the current team. So one of the last big international agreements signed between the US and China was the wonderfully named, they searched for months to find a town in California called Sunnylands, and they had the President Xi and President Biden sign the so-called Sunnylands Agreement in that town, and then stroll through San Francisco at the last Asia Pacific Forum meeting, 2023, and talk about an agreement where the US and China agreed to work together on clean energy to push for a tripling of the amount of clean energy by 2030. Turns out the only country on pace to get to that goal is, surprise, surprise, China. The US and Europe, Africa, Southeast Asia are not on pace to get there. But everything I've tried to tell you in the talk so far highlights, I hope, that this would not be that difficult. But to highlight how much of an interesting challenge this is, just kind of consider this graph here. So the colored part up to 2022, when we published this paper, highlights the share of clean energy growth in the rest of the world, in turquoise, in China, in red, in orange, in the United States. And that's where we were then. And the path we were on is the lower end of this line that would get to a doubling of the clean energy capacity in 2030, if not for Mr. Trump, who has turned away from essentially all of these agreements. But just look what this says. That says that the path we were on, even under Biden, would have doubled the amount of clean energy, meaning that the deficit, the acceleration we need, is about the size of that green bar. And if you move the green bar down, you will see, to your horror or not surprise, that it is about equal to the total amount we had deployed when this paper was written in 2022, meaning we are going to have to find a way to undo the Trump mess and accelerate even beyond the Inflation Reduction Act, which is going to be a huge challenge because we're not going to have many years, meaning this target is almost certainly not going to happen. But I'm hoping that we talked about today highlighted that a justice framework highlights a huge range of opportunities. We have the tools. We have just shown a lack of interest in deploying them, and a particular lack of interest in building the kind of coalitions and partnerships that would bring down the cost of energy and emissions, not just for the poor, which seems to be the thing that this administration is afraid of, doing anything at all positive for poor people, but for everybody. And so if I could just highlight one aspect of the story, it is really that whether we make it or not, the Gen Z folks are going to look back and say, we had all the tools to do this way back in the 20-teens, 2020s. And for reasons that people will have to dissect, we simply chose not to invest in the better, cheaper, more job producing economy for what? And I leave you with the question of what is that what? Is it simply a inability of Democrats and Republicans to talk? Is it the fear of undereducated white males? I mean, there's lots of ways we can describe it, but we are choosing not to go down this path for reasons that will need dissection, whether we're around to do that dissection or not.